Tonight, we'll explore 6 terrifying true encounters from the Cumberland Mountains. These aren't just legends. These are the stories real people claim they lived through. The first account comes from a man named David, a lifelong outdoorsman who swore he would never return to the Cumberland Mountains after what he experienced one autumn nearly 15 years ago. David had always been comfortable in the wild. Born and raised in Kentucky, his father taught him to hunt when he was barely 10 years old. By the time he reached his mid-30s, he had been on countless trips, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. He liked the solitude. He liked the stillness of the forest when it was just him and the trees. The Cumberland Range was a place he had visited more than once, though never in the area he chose that year. A coworker had mentioned spotting deer sign deeper in the ridges, an area most hunters avoided because the terrain was rough, the trails faint, and the cell service non-existent. For David, that was part of the appeal. The fewer people he crossed paths with, the better. He drove out early that October morning, arriving just as the first light bled across the horizon. The mountain air carried a sharp bite, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. He parked his truck on the edge of an old logging road, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and began the long hike inward. At first, everything was as he expected. The forest was alive with sound woodpeckers tapping against hollow trunks, squirrels darting across the underbrush, the occasional distant call of a hawk, the kind of morning he loved, where the quiet was not silence but the hum of nature itself. He spent hours wandering, marking deer tracks in soft soil, studying scat, noting the bends where they might pass through at dawn. Around midday, he stopped near a rocky outcrop, sat against a fallen log, and ate the sandwich he'd packed. It was during that break that he noticed the first strange detail. The woods had gone still. Not quiet in the usual way hunters know the forest ebbs and flows with sound. This was different. Absolute stillness. The kind that makes your ears ring because there's no ambient noise to fill the space. No birds, no scurrying chipmunks. Just the faint whisper of wind threading through branches far overhead. At first, David thought maybe a predator was nearby, a coyote, maybe a bobcat, but he'd hunted long enough to know the difference. Even predators don't hush the woods completely. This felt wrong. He shook it off and pressed deeper. But that feeling of being watched crept in not long after. He started to notice faint sounds behind him, footsteps. Slow, steady. Always just far enough that when he turned, he saw nothing. He even crouched once, pretending to tie his boot, ears straining for movement. And that's when he heard it clear as day 2 more steps, crunching softly against dry leaves. He spun around, rifle raised, but the trees stood silent and empty. He called out, "Anybody out there?" Silence. David told himself it was just his imagination, the paranoia that sometimes comes from being alone too long. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that something was trailing him, staying just out of sight. Then he found the carvings. About a mile deeper, he came across a series of trees marked with strange symbols. Not hunter signs, not initials. These were rough, angular shapes, some overlapping, others slashed into the bark with surprising force. One of them, a tall oak, bore a symbol that looked almost like an eye with jagged lines radiating outward. He ran his fingers over the grooves. They weren't fresh enough to bleed sap, but they weren't old either. Days, maybe weeks. He'd never seen anything like them in his years outdoors. As the day stretched on, clouds rolled in, muting the light. By late afternoon, the forest was dim, shadows thickening as if dusk had arrived early. David checked his watch, realized he should start making his way back. He turned, retracing the route, or at least he thought he did. But something was wrong. Landmarks he remembered were gone. The rock outcrop where he'd eaten lunch, the crooked birch with its pale bark peeling. Like paper, none of it appeared where it should have been. He pulled out his compass, but the needle spun in lazy circles, refusing to hold steady. His stomach sank. Getting lost in those mountains wasn't just an inconvenience, it could be deadly. That's when he heard it. Breathing. Low, heavy, deliberate. Not close, but near enough to freeze him in place. It wasn't the short panting of an animal. It was deep, guttural, like something drawing air through a chest too large, too heavy. He gripped his rifle tighter, eyes darting between the trees. The sound shifted, drifting from his left to behind him, though nothing moved. Then the smell hit faint at first, but growing stronger. The stench of decay, of something dead and rotting in the underbrush, and then he saw it. A figure between the trees. Tall, wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its shoulders hunched in unnatural angles. The fading light caught its eyes, two glowing orbs, staring directly at him. Not reflecting like a deer's, but shining with their own dim, steady light. David said the air turned cold, so cold he could see his breath fog in front of him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He stood rooted, heart pounding, until the silence broke. Snap. A branch cracked, loud as a gunshot, just beyond the figure. Then another, and another. Not one creature moving, but several, circling, closing in. That snapped him out of his paralysis. He bolted, crashing through brush, stumbling over roots, tearing his jacket on branches. He didn't care. He just ran. He said the woods seemed to twist around him, every turn leading back into darkness. Several times he swore he saw that same clearing again, the carved trees watching him like silent sentries. Panic nearly swallowed him whole. Finally, just as exhaustion threatened to drag him down, he stumbled upon a stream. Relief surged through him. He remembered passing it earlier. He followed it, legs shaking, lungs burning, until at last, the faint glimmer of the road appeared through the trees. But just before he broke free of the forest, something happened that has haunted him ever since. From deep in the woods behind him, he heard his name. Not shouted, not spoken. Drawn out in a voice warped and hollow, stretched into something inhuman. David. He didn't turn around. He didn't dare. He sprinted until he reached his truck, slammed the door, and sped down that old logging road without looking back. By the time he reached cell service, it was nearly 1 a.m. He pulled over, hands trembling, and tried to convince himself it had been stress, fatigue, maybe even a hallucination. But no matter how many times he replayed it in his mind, he couldn't explain the symbols, the compass, the figure, or that voice. David never returned to the Cumberland Mountains. He won't even drive near them anymore. And when asked what he thinks he saw that night, his answer is always the same. It wasn't human, and it didn't want me to leave. The second story comes from a woman named Rachel, who grew up not far from the Cumberland Mountains. Unlike many people in that area, she wasn't much of a hiker, and she had never gone hunting a day in her life. The woods weren't her escape. If anything, she always felt uneasy around them. But in her early 20s, She had an experience on a lonely back road that still keeps her awake at night. Rachel was working at a small diner on the outskirts of town back then. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid her bills while she took night classes at the community college. Most nights she closed the diner, which meant driving home well past midnight. Normally, that wasn't a big deal. She was used to the quiet, used to being alone and on the road. Her usual route cut through the edges of the Cumberland Range. A long, winding two-lane road bordered on both sides by towering trees. In daylight, it was beautiful. But at night, it was a different story. No streetlights, no houses. Just a tunnel of black forest swallowing the headlights as far as the eye could see. She hated that stretch of road, but it was the fastest way home. On this particular night, the air was damp, the fog thick enough to turn the world into a haze of shifting gray. She could barely see 20 feet in front of her, and the high beams did little more than illuminate the mist. The road seemed endless, every curve blending into the next. At first, she thought nothing of it. She turned up the radio, cracked her window to stay awake, and focused on the yellow center line, glowing faintly beneath the fog. But about 10 minutes in, her headlights caught something on the side of the road, a man. Or at least, that's what she thought it was. He was standing just inside the tree line, motionless, his posture stiff, arms hanging loosely at his sides. He wore a long, tattered coat that hung past his knees and a wide, brimmed hat tilted forward, hiding most of his face. Rachel instinctively slowed, thinking maybe he was lost or needed help. The thought of leaving someone out there alone in the dark didn't sit right with her. But the closer she got, the more something about him set her nerves on edge. He didn't move. Not a shift, not a twitch. He didn't even acknowledge the sound of her car rolling toward him. As her headlights washed over him, he turned his head. What she saw made her slam her foot down on the gas. Beneath the brim of that old hat wasn't a face. Not a human one, anyway. His skin was pale, stretched taut like old parchment, with no nose, no mouth, just a blank surface where his features should have been. And his eyes, or rather, the pits where eyes should have been, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs as she sped past him, gripping the wheel so tight her hands ached. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The road ahead seemed to stretch longer than it should have. She knew this route. She knew exactly where she should have been. But minutes turned into half an hour, then longer, with no sign of the gas station or the small crossroads that usually marked the halfway point. Her chest grew tight with panic. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and then she saw him again, standing at the side of the road. Same coat, same hat, same impossible face. Her stomach flipped. She hadn't slowed down not once. She hadn't turned off the road. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her. But there he was, standing in the fog, angled toward the oncoming car, like he'd been waiting for her. She gritted her teeth and pressed harder on the gas. She refused to look directly at him, but in her peripheral vision, she swore she saw his head turn, following her car as it tore past. The road warped into something unfamiliar. Mile after mile, no landmarks, no signs, no gas station. Just endless trees clawing upward into the fog, their branches knitting together overhead like skeletal fingers. Her radio flickered with static, a sharp hiss that drowned out the music until she had to shut it off. Even her headlights seemed dimmer, as though the fog itself was feeding on the light. Rachel whispered prayers under her breath, begging to see something familiar, anything to tell her she wasn't trapped in some nightmare loop. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, her vision blurred with tears. Finally, she saw light ahead, a warm orange glow breaking through the fog. Relief washed over her in a flood so strong she nearly sobbed. It was the gas station. The sign buzzed faintly in the mist, just where it should have been. But her relief shattered in an instant, because standing directly beneath that sign was the man. Only this time, he wasn't off to the side. He wasn't waiting at the edge of the forest. He was standing in the middle of the road, facing her car head-on. His wide-brimmed hat tilted upward now, giving her a full view of that impossible face. Skin like wax, no mouth, no nose. Just those pits, dark and endless, boring into her headlights. Rachel screamed, yanking the wheel hard to the right. Her car skidded, tires screeching against gravel as she narrowly missed slamming straight into him. For a brief second, she thought she clipped his coat, but when she looked back through her rearview mirror, he was gone. Her chest heaved, lungs burning as she pulled into the gas station lot. She sat there in her car, shaking so badly she could barely put it into park. The neon sign buzzed above her, casting an eerie glow across the cracked pavement. The only other sound was the faint hum of the icebox against the station wall. Gathering what courage she had left, she stumbled inside. The clerk on duty glanced up and froze when he saw her. "You okay, miss?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel couldn't speak at first. She just bought a bottle of water, her hands trembling as she passed over the cash. Her voice cracked as she asked how far the drive was from her workplace to the station. The clerk frowned. 15 minutes, tops. Why? Rachel stared at him, numb, because she had been driving for over an hour. That was the last time Rachel ever took that road at night. Even years later, she refuses to drive it after dark, no matter how much longer the detour might take. And when people ask what she thinks she saw, her answer never changes. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything human. And whatever it was, it wanted me to notice it. The third story comes from a man named Kyle, a land surveyor who spent nearly 15 years working in some of the most remote corners of Tennessee and Kentucky. He was the kind of man who loved solitude. Cities drained him, crowds gave him headaches, but the silence of the woods, that was home. He used to say that when you're alone in the wilderness, you learn the difference between the silence of peace and the silence of warning. He didn't really understand that distinction himself until the summer of 2009, when a routine assignment in the Cumberland Mountains changed the course of his life forever. Kyle had been paired with another surveyor named Mason, a younger man fresh out of college. Mason was eager, always cracking jokes, and thought nothing in the woods could scare him. The company they worked for had sent them to map a stretch of untouched land, property that a development firm was considering buying. Their job was simple: spend 3 days marking boundaries, recording coordinates, and filing reports. Getting there, however, was no small task. The site was far off any paved road, tucked deep in a tangle of ridges and hollows where cell signals didn't exist, and even old forest maps were vague. They parked their truck at the end of a rutted logging trail and hiked for miles with heavy packs, full of gear, GPS units, compasses, measuring tools, and a tent. The first day was exhausting but uneventful. They followed ridgelines, dropped markers, and worked until the light began to fade. Mason joked about how quiet it was, saying he couldn't hear a single bird. Kyle noticed it too, but he kept his thoughts to himself. That evening, they set up camp on a ridge with a sweeping view of the valley below. The forest was still too still. Mason fell asleep quickly, snoring softly, while Kyle lay awake, staring at the fabric of the tent overhead. It must have been close to midnight when he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent in careful, measured paces. Kyle held his breath. At first, he told himself it had to be a deer, but deer didn't move like that. They didn't walk in perfect, deliberate arcs around a tent. And then came the whispering. At first, it sounded like wind slipping through the trees. But no, the voice was too close. It pressed against the thin nylon of the tent, low and guttural, a string of broken syllables in a language he couldn't recognize. Kyle's heart thundered in his chest. He wanted to shake Mason awake, but fear pinned him to the ground. The voice circled, drifting from one side of the tent to the other, until finally the footsteps faded into the distance. He must have eventually dozed off, because the next thing he knew, sunlight was spilling into the tent. He tried to convince himself it had been a dream, until Mason said over breakfast, "Hey, did you hear someone talking last night? I swear I heard chanting, like some guy was walking around us." Kyle didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew something had been out there. That day, their work began to unravel. The GPS units malfunctioned, giving the same coordinates no matter where they stood. Their compasses spun lazily, refusing to lock on north, and the trails they had marked the day before seemed to vanish. By late afternoon, they stumbled into a clearing they hadn't seen on the map. A circle, 30 feet across, marked by stones upright, stacked, deliberately placed. Moss clung to them, but the arrangement was unmistakable. Mason tried to laugh it off. Old campfire ring, maybe? Some weird hippie thing. But Kyle's stomach twisted. The stones were too heavy to have been moved casually. Some were sunk deep into the earth, as if they had been there for generations. He felt eyes on him, though the clearing was empty. They left quickly, neither willing to say what they were thinking. That evening, when the sky dimmed and they set up camp again, the forest seemed heavier. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was waiting. The noises came back after dark. At first, soft footsteps, then the same whispering voice. But this time there were two. Low voices, overlapping, speaking words that scraped against Kyle's nerves like blades. Mason whispered from his sleeping bag, "You hear it too, right?" Kyle nodded, though Mason couldn't see him. He wanted to unzip the tent, shine his flashlight outside. But some primal part of his brain screamed, "Don't look." When the whispers finally faded, they didn't sleep. They lay in silence, listening to the woods breathe. The next morning, something had changed. Their gear was disturbed. Stakes they'd driven into the ground had been pulled out. The markers they'd left were gone. And when they tried to retrace their path, the forest seemed to twist against them. Hours later, they stumbled into the same clearing again. But this time, the clearing wasn't empty. In the center of the stone ring lay a deer. Freshly dead, its body contorted at impossible angles, every limb broken as though by invisible hands. Its glassy eyes stared upward, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Mason gagged and turned away. Kyle felt his throat close. It hadn't been eaten, hadn't even been cut open. It was just broken. That was when Mason's bravado cracked. "We need to get the hell out of here. Now." They packed in a rush, abandoning half their equipment. But leaving wasn't simple. No matter which direction they walked, the forest looped back on itself. Trails disappeared. Landmarks shifted. By dusk, panic had set in, and then the forest came alive with footsteps. Not one, not two, but many. Moving in the brush, circling, closing in. The laughter started next, thin, hollow, carrying across the trees in broken echoes. Kyle swung his flashlight wildly, and for a split second, he saw it. A figure, too tall, too thin. Its limbs dangled unnaturally, almost touching the ground. Its head tilted far to one side, watching them from the tree line. He blinked, and it was gone. They ran blindly through the darkness, crashing through branches, stumbling over roots. Every time they stopped to catch their breath, the footsteps followed. Sometime past midnight, they stumbled onto an old logging road. Exhausted, scraped, and half delirious, they followed it until hours later, it spilled them back to their truck. Kyle sat behind the wheel, trembling so badly he could barely start the engine. Mason vomited on the ground beside the truck. Neither of them spoke on the drive back. Within a month, Kyle quit surveying altogether. He never set foot in the Cumberland Mountains again. When people ask him why, he never tells the full story. He just says the same thing every time, his voice flat and haunted. The mountains don't want us there, and whatever does want us isn't human. This story comes from a man named David, who grew up in a quiet town at the edge of the Cumberland Mountains. To David, the mountains weren't just a view on the horizon. They were part of his everyday life. His earliest memories were of fishing for trout in the icy streams, helping his father stack firewood cut from the ridge, and running through the forest trails barefoot in the summer. The mountains felt safe, familiar, but there was something unspoken in his family's relationship with them, something shadowy that always hovered beneath the surface. It was in the way his grandmother would pause at dusk, staring toward the tree line before locking the doors. It was in the way his grandfather's stories would trail off whenever he started talking about nights in the woods. And it was in the warnings that stuck in David's mind, repeated so often that they became etched into him like scripture. "The mountains don't just belong to us," his grandfather would mutter. "They've got other things in them, old things. Respect the woods, boy. And if you ever hear your name being called after dark, don't answer." David had always brushed it off as superstition. He was a teenager when he first heard it, and like most teenagers, he thought it was just old folks being dramatic. But in the summer of 1998, when he was 21 years old, David finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to tell him. That summer, David, his cousin Mark, and two friends, Tyler and Shane, decided to spend a weekend at a hunting cabin that belonged to Mark's uncle. The cabin was ancient, built by hand sometime in the 1940s, and tucked so deep in the forest it felt like the world had forgotten it. No power lines, no neighbors, not even a proper road. Just a clearing cut into the trees, a stone chimney, and weathered wooden planks that creaked with every step. For four young men, it sounded perfect. A weekend without rules, away from everything. They packed beer, food, and sleeping bags and set out in the early afternoon. The sun was still high when they reached the cabin, painting the woods gold. Everything seemed normal. They dropped their gear, chopped some firewood, and set about enjoying their weekend. The first night started off as nothing but fun. They grilled hot dogs over the fire, told crude jokes, and passed a bottle around until their laughter echoed into the woods. But sometime after midnight, when the fire had died low and the conversation quieted, they heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the wall of the cabin. All of them went still. The sound was clear and deliberate, like knuckles rapping against wood. Tyler forced a laugh. "It's probably just a branch," he said, though his voice was too high, too strained. Then came 3 more knocks, this time on the opposite wall. Shane swore under his breath, grabbing a flashlight. He flung the cabin door open, shining the beam into the clearing. The fire cast weak shadows across the grass. The woods loomed, silent and dark. Nothing moved. They checked the perimeter, their boots crunching softly in the dirt. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of animals. The clearing was empty. They went back inside, trying to shake it off. But the rest of the night was restless. Every creak of the cabin set their nerves on edge. Every groan of the timbers sounded too close, too heavy. By dawn, they were all bleary-eyed and on edge. The next day passed quietly enough. They hiked a ridge trail, skipped rocks in the creek, and tried to laugh at themselves for being spooked. But David couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. Every time he lagged behind, he swore he heard footsteps in the brush, matching his pace, stopping when he stopped. Once, when he glanced over his shoulder, he thought he saw a figure standing between the trees, tall, still, watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time, faster. Not 3 knocks, but 5, then 7, circling the cabin. First one wall, then another, as though whatever was outside was moving around them in deliberate steps. Shane cursed, shoving his boots on. "I've had enough of this." He yanked open the door and shouted into the woods, "Whoever's out there, knock it the hell off." His words carried into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. The forest gave no reply, and then came the voice. It drifted from the tree line, low and dragging, yet clear as day. "David." The sound froze him. It wasn't one of his friends. It wasn't any voice he knew. It was hollow, stretched, as though something was trying to form his name, but didn't quite know how. His cousin Mark went pale. He whispered, almost desperately, "Don't answer." No matter what, the voice came again. Closer. David. David's blood turned cold. His grandfather's words slammed back into his mind. "If you ever hear your name being called after dark, don't answer." The others looked to him, wide-eyed. Tyler whispered, "What the hell is that?" "Who knows you're here?" No one had told anyone where they were going. The cabin was miles from the nearest house. Nobody should have known. For the next half hour, the voice circled them. Sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seemed to press against the thin walls of the cabin. Always calling David's name. Always just his. At one point, he thought he saw something move in the firelight outside, a shape, tall and thin, standing just beyond the glow. Its head cocked unnaturally to one side, watching. When he blinked, it was gone. They sat in silence, clutching flashlights and knives, until the voice finally faded with the first gray light of dawn. None of them slept. When morning came, they packed their bags in a rush. Not one of them suggested staying another night. As they loaded their gear into the truck, David glanced down at the ground near the cabin steps and froze. There were footprints in the mud, bare, human-like, but impossibly long, with toes that seemed stretched and uneven. They trailed off into the forest, leading back into the shadows where the voice had come from. David never returned to that cabin. To this day, he refuses to even drive near that stretch of mountains. And when people ask him why, he only says this: "The mountains don't just echo your voice. Sometimes they echo back something else." Claire always told people she wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. She considered herself practical, the kind of woman who needed proof before buying into anything strange. But the Cumberland Mountains, they had a way of changing how you thought about things. She grew up near their shadow, in a town where the streets seemed to end right where the forest began. Her parents were cautious people, always careful, always watchful of the woods. And though they didn't say it outright, Claire understood early on that the mountains weren't just hills and trees. They were something older, something that watched back. Her father had little sayings he'd repeat whenever she lingered near the tree line after dark. "Don't whistle, Claire. You don't want to call something that'll answer." Or, "Stay off the ridge when the sun drops. The dark don't play fair up there." She always laughed it off. Until that one summer night. It was June 2004. She and her husband, Ethan, had been married less than 2 years, still in that restless stage where every weekend felt like an opportunity for adventure. They didn't have kids yet, didn't have many responsibilities. So, when Ethan suggested they pack up the tent and drive into the mountains for a weekend of camping, Claire agreed. The drive out was beautiful, the kind of summer afternoon where the sky was too blue to believe and the roads wound through endless greenery. They parked near an old hunting trail Ethan had found on a map, a trail so overgrown it looked more like an animal path than anything made for people. That only made it better in their minds private, untouched, perfect. By evening, they'd set up camp beside a narrow stream. The sound of rushing water was calming, and when they built their little fire and sat side by side roasting hot dogs, Claire felt safe. More than safe. She felt free. The first half of the night passed like something out of a postcard. Stars burned bright above the black tree canopy. Fireflies blinked like floating embers in the grass. They talked about their future, about buying a bigger house, about maybe starting a family. The world felt steady, simple. But sometime after midnight, Claire woke up. It wasn't a sound that stirred her, at least, not one she could place. It was more like a shift in the air, a weight pressing down on her chest that told her something was wrong. She opened her eyes inside the tent, listening. At first, all she heard was the steady stream and the occasional chirp of insects. She almost convinced herself it was nothing, and then she heard it. A voice, faint, far off, but undeniably human. "Help me?" Claire sat up slowly, her heart pounding. For a second, she wondered if she was still dreaming. But then the voice came again, fragile and strained, drifting through the trees. "Please, help." She shook Ethan awake.
"Did you hear that?"
He groaned, half asleep. "It's just probably an animal. Go back to sleep." But she knew the sound of human speech when she heard it. It wasn't a coyote or an owl. It was a woman, and she sounded hurt. Claire unzipped the tent before Ethan could stop her. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting weak light across the clearing. Beyond that, the forest was pitch black. She strained her eyes, but saw nothing. "Hello," she called softly. Ethan sat up sharply. "Don't answer it." His voice was sharp enough to make her freeze. He crawled over, pulling the flap shut again. "Just don't." She frowned at him. "What if someone's hurt?" Ethan shook his head, his face pale in the dim light. "That's not someone." Before Claire could argue, the voice came again. Louder this time. Closer. "Help me." Claire's skin prickled. It didn't sound weak anymore, it sounded deliberate. Like the words were being formed carefully. She clutched Ethan's arm. "How would you know that?" His jaw tightened. "Because my grandfather told me. He used to hunt up here. Said sometimes you hear voices calling for you. Voices that don't belong to anyone living." Claire went cold. She remembered her father's warnings, the ones she'd laughed off. "Don't whistle. Don't wander after dark." They weren't silly, were they? They were warnings, real ones. The voice shifted then. Claire. Her stomach dropped. Her name. No one knew where they were. Not her parents, not her friends. No one. The voice came again, longer this time, dragging out each syllable. "Eerie." Ethan grabbed her wrist, holding her tight. "Don't answer it," he whispered. His voice was low, almost shaking. "If you answer, it'll know it has you." She wanted to ask what that meant, but the words stuck in her throat. The voice circled their campsite that night. Sometimes it sounded like a woman. Sometimes it sounded like a child, sobbing and calling for help. Once, it even mimicked Ethan's voice, perfectly. She nearly unzipped the tent then, thinking he had somehow gone outside, but Ethan grabbed her hand and shook his head furiously. The longer it went on, the less human it sounded. The tone stretched too long, syllables breaking in strange places, like someone trying to imitate speech without understanding it. At one point, the footsteps began. Slow, heavy crunches in the brush. They circled the tent, dragging at times, like something moving unevenly, limping or worse, crawling. Claire pressed her face into Ethan's shoulder, too terrified to even breathe. Every time the footsteps paused, the voice whispered her name. By the time dawn came, she was trembling so hard her teeth ached. And then silence. Not the gradual quiet of the woods settling down. No. It was instant. One moment, the voice was at the edge of the tent, saying her name with a mocking sweetness. The next, it was gone. They didn't waste time. As soon as there was light in the sky, they packed their things and left. Neither spoke a word until they were back in the car, engine roaring as they sped down the mountain road. Only then did Ethan finally break the silence. His words still ring in Claire's ears. "My grandfather said they borrow voices," he told her quietly. "That sometimes they use the sound of someone you trust to pull you away." Claire never went camping again. Even now, years later, she says if she closes her eyes at night, she can still hear it. That hollow, dragging voice from the woods. Claire. The last story tonight comes from a man named Tom, a retired park ranger who spent over 2 decades working in and around the Cumberland Mountains. Tom is not the kind of man you'd expect to rattle easily. Broad-shouldered, weathered by years of sun and storms, with a steady, patient way of speaking that made you feel like nothing in the world could surprise him. He'd faced down bears, rescued stranded hikers, even pulled people out of floods. But when he told me this story, there was a heaviness in his voice, a look in his eyes that told me even now he wished he had never seen what he saw that night. This happened in the late 1990s, during the middle of summer. The Park Service had been receiving scattered reports of strange activity, distant fires spotted at night in parts of the forest where no campers should have been, and echoes of voices carrying through the valleys long after dark. Normally, these kinds of reports turned out to be nothing more than teenagers sneaking out to drink or hunters stretching the rules. But Tom was thorough. He volunteered to check one of the more remote fire roads that cut into the forest and trailed off near an old ridge. He set out just after sunset, driving his truck as far as the gravel road would take him before stepping out into the thick, heavy air of a summer night. The forest was alive around him, cicadas droning, frogs croaking, the hum of countless unseen insects. He slung his pack over his shoulder, checked his flashlight, and began the mile-long hike to where the reports had pointed. For the first half hour, everything was normal. The crunch of boots on the trail, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint glow of the moon breaking through the canopy. But then he noticed the forest around him seemed to be changing. The cicadas went quiet. The frogs silenced. The hum of insects faded. He stopped frowning. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows the silence of a predator when the forest falls still because something dangerous is near. But this didn't feel like a bobcat or a bear. This silence was deeper, heavier, as though the air itself was holding its breath. That's when he saw the glow. Through the trees, maybe a few hundred yards ahead, a dull orange light pulsed against the darkness. It wasn't steady, like a lantern or campfire. It was erratic, swelling bright, dimming, then flaring again as though it was breathing. Tom crouched low, moving carefully now. His hand hovered over his radio, but something about the quiet made him hesitate. He told me later that he felt watched, that if he made a sound, if he spoke aloud, something would hear him, something that wasn't supposed to. When he reached the clearing, he froze. In the center of the open space was a perfect circle of stones, each one about the size of a football, stacked carefully in a ring. Inside the ring, fire burned, but not the way fire should. There was no wood, no fuel, just flames rising directly from the dirt, twisting in shapes that seemed almost alive. And standing around the fire were 4 figures. At first glance, Tom thought they were people. But the longer he looked, the less certain he became. They were too tall, their arms too long, their bodies oddly proportioned, as though their joints bent wrong. Their movements weren't smooth like people's. They jerked, shifted, twitched like marionettes pulled by strings. They didn't speak. They didn't chant. But every so often, in eerie unison, they raised their arms toward the sky. Each time they did, the flames leapt higher, shadows stretching long across the clearing. Tom's mouth had gone dry. His first instinct was to back away, to return the way he came and pretend he had never seen this. He started to move, one careful step at a time. But then, his boot found a dry branch. The snap echoed like a gunshot. The figures stopped. All 4 heads turned toward him in perfect unison, jerking so fast it didn't look possible. Their faces caught the firelight for just a moment, and Tom swore they weren't faces at all, not fully. Their features seemed blurred, stretched, like clay pulled too thin. Eye sockets too wide, mouths too long. Tom's body reacted before his mind could. He ran. He tore through the underbrush, branches ripping at his arms and face. He didn't look back, but he could hear them. Footsteps, at first 4 of them, then more, dozens, heavy, crashing steps pounding after him. closing the distance with terrifying speed. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning. He knew the fire road wasn't far, but every second stretched like an eternity. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and with them came something worse. Voices, not words, just a sound, low and guttural, like laughter that didn't belong in any human throat. The sound rose and fell as they chased him, blending with the pounding of feet, until it felt like the whole forest was alive, mocking him. When the trees finally broke and his truck came into view, relief nearly knocked him to his knees. He flung himself into the cab, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered, coughed, refused to catch. His hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the keys. He tried again and again. Behind him, at the edge of the fire road, figures emerged. Not four anymore, not even a dozen. Shadows upon shadows, tall and thin, standing in unnatural stillness, just beyond the reach of the headlights. The engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as Tom floored the accelerator, the truck fishtailing before finding grip and surging down the road. He didn't look back. Not once, not until he had put miles between himself and that clearing. When he finally stopped, breath ragged, sweat pouring down his face, he realized something strange. The cab smelled of smoke, sharp and acrid, as though the fire had followed him. The next morning, he returned to the spot with two other rangers. They hiked to the clearing in full daylight, radios on, sidearms ready. But when they arrived, there was nothing. No stones, no fire, not even a trace of ash. The ground was undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there at all. Tom finished out his career with the Park Service, but he never took another night patrol. He avoided that part of the mountains altogether. Even now, years later, he avoids talking about it. When I asked him, quietly, what he believed he saw that night, he didn't hesitate. I think the mountains are older than us, older than our kind. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you wander into a place where something old is still waiting. Something that remembers we don't belong there. And if you're lucky, you get out. Once.